All right. Now, let's see how my camera's going to fare. I can see it's stopping and starting a little bit. If it gives us any trouble, I'll probably turn my camera off. Welcome, everybody, to Fair Farms webinar number 6. And today we're going to be looking at code or codes of conduct. Many of you will already have some form of code of conduct in your business. And I thought it's probably timely just to have a look at the kinds of things that would go into a code, why we would need a code, excuse me, why we would need a code, and whether or not they actually do provide benefits for us. So as always, before we kick off into the heavy duty stuff, Fair Farms would like to acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of the First Nations people on the lands that we meet today. We recognise their connection to land and environment and celebrate their care for country for over 60,000 years. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we value their skills and knowledge as our first horticulturalists and look forward to learning with a persistent curiosity. Okay, let's have a look at what we're going to be talking about today. Codes of conduct are always a little interesting because, people will be people. So there's a question about whether or not we can legislate behaviour. I want to look at this, the difference between a code of ethics and a code of conduct. They can, in fact, be one document and often are, but they also can be two quite distinct documents. I want to talk a little bit about some frameworks and processes. Who do they benefit and do they actually work? We'll look at a few content the code, the kind of things that you might want to be looking at, and some you may not have thought of. We want to talk about management commitment, or as I call it, living the dream, training and implementation of your code in the workplace, and of course managing breaches of the code, because a code of conduct is not much use without some type of enforcement and consequences. And I caught this quote yesterday when I was doing some research from Martin Luther King, and I thought it was apt. Even though morality cannot be legislated, behaviour can be regulated. While the law cannot change the heart, it can certainly restrain the heartless. So on that happy, cheery note, let's kick off in earnest. So can we legislate behaviour? No, look, we can't really. Laws only define the limits of acceptable behaviour, and then they establish punishments or disciplinary actions for those who don't respect or adhere to these limits. However, punishments are always after the fact, and they're only applied to those who get caught doing the wrong thing. So what we want is something that is preventative rather than reactive. Behaviours are largely what people choose to do, and that includes obviously in the workforce. And I think what changes people's behaviour is a sense of empathy and a sense of responsibility, whether that's social responsibility or workplace responsibility. It all comes under the same banner. But strong leadership and a supportive environment. And we'll talk about some of those things. So effectively, we need a framework. So looking at this little word cloud here, some of the words, and this is not a bad place to start when you're thinking about your code of conduct, because bear in mind, some of the things that we'll be looking at may apply or may not apply to you. And I'm not a believer in having wads and wads of documents, pardon me, setting out things that you just don't use. But in establishing the things that you believe in and identifying the behaviours that you want to encourage within your workplace, you can establish that framework for a great workplace culture, one based on respect, trust, collaboration and accountability. And that's pretty much what we all want in the workplace. Okay, your business code of ethics. So we talk about a code of ethics rather than a code of conduct in this part. So a code of ethics actually governs your decision making. So it tells your staff, your investors, your clients, your customers, your suppliers, how you conduct your business and what standards you set for yourself, your company and your workers. It's about providing a framework for honesty and integrity and a set of guiding principles that dictates how your actions will be judged. So it's about principles rather than procedure. And an ethical framework demands something more than mere compliance. So, I beg your pardon. I keep doing this, don't I? So A code of conduct, however, governs actions. So a code of conduct, it does not propose to tell people what to think or how to think, but it does guide employees on how they should act within the workplace. It asks employees to exercise judgment and accept personal responsibility for the decisions that they make. And it provides a bit more detail on the specific rules and processes to ensure that it's adhered to and implemented properly and effectively. So if we look at a code of ethics, just going back to that notion again, a code of ethics can encompass areas such as business ethics, a code of professional practice. So many professions have a code of professional practice. You think medical, you think nursing, and a whole range of other professions have their own codified practices, and an employee code of conduct. So we can see now that it kind of operates as a bit of an umbrella. And look, these are probably not exhaustive, and it may be that you come up with something others, but generally speaking, we have 12 general business ethics principles, and they include statements around things such as leadership, accountability, integrity, respect for others, honesty, respect for the laws, responsibility, transparency, compassion, fairness, loyalty, and of course, environmental concern, which is becoming more and more important as we move through the 21st century. So when we're thinking about establishing a code of ethics, we might look at these things and say, how would we like to articulate how we lead our team? How would we like to articulate how we approach accountability? So those are some of the things that you might put into a code of ethics. There's lots and lots of examples around. There's hundreds of thousands of them actually. So you won't be at a loss for any resources, but obviously we'll be pointing you towards the Fair Funds Standard and the Fair Funds Program, because we have a set of standards that apply to both ethical principles and codes of conduct, where we require, as part of your online self-assessment and your audit process, that you have a policy statement outlining your commitment to professional business practice and ethical conduct, and an intolerance of any forms of bribery, inducement or corruption. And then we say we want you to have a code of conduct in place, either also or in the same document, that identifies unacceptable behaviours. So it provides a bit more detail about your expectations, and trains the workers in that code. It's really important that workers are trained properly. So, as we've said, a code of conduct outlines your business vision, your rules, your values, and your ethical principles. So it should clearly explain what is expected of your staff in relation to their behaviour and their performance, both inside and outside of your organisation, outside of the workplace. It helps keep all individuals to the same standard. There's nothing worse than having people operating at different standards and under different rules, or being allowed to ignore those rules. It encourages ethical behaviour within your business. By setting that framework, it makes the business a better place to work because you have a sense of fairness and accountability. It can lead to long-term success for employees and the business. It illustrates the company's vision and mission. So again, it's about being public, about making your commitments and your statements around your ethics and your code of conduct. So effectively, your code of conduct is a central guide and a reference for employees to support their day-to-day decision-making. It's a really important document. Okay, where did I get to? Here. But like everything, consistency is the key. Every business is different. They have their own beliefs, they have their own values, and they have their own culture. So your code of conduct needs to fit with what you do. Obviously, it needs to address those key issues, the purpose that it's written for, but it may look different to the guys next door, or somebody in Victoria, or somebody running a different type of operation. Every employee, likewise, is different. They come from different backgrounds, they come from different experiences in business, in work, and they develop their own set of behaviours. So it's then a case of how do we actually align your expectations and employee behaviours. So it's a code of conduct that helps to keep all those individuals within the organisation to the same standard. The rules within it are to be followed by everyone. And I'm going to make a bit of a point about this. I want to reiterate it within the business, regardless of their position, their status, or other differences. Because if the code does not explicitly state that the rules and principles apply to every individual, it can cause and will cause employees to feel unfairly treated. Resentment can build and you have problems. So it can make them feel targeted if they have to follow a set of standards which upper management do not have to, or which they choose to ignore, or which they consistently breach. The standard you walk by is the standard you set. And that's a very old saying that works very well in this situation. So take a moment to think about your company values, remembering the word cloud, where we have words like integrity and teamwork and compassion and diversity. So what kind of behaviour do you actually want to encourage in your workplace? Do you want people to operate with high levels of integrity, high levels of honesty? Do you want them to be really engaged in a team? Not all teams are like that. Some teams can work quite efficiently, without being best friends and best buddies outside of work. But teamwork is nonetheless really important to your overall objectives. Do you expect loyalty? And do you want diversity within your workforce? Do you encourage different types of employees? Do you encourage communication and engagement between all those different employees? Similarly, you should set out what behaviour is unacceptable. Now, that isn't going to be an exhaustive list, because you're bound to find someone jumping off a packing house roof or something, which is not always accounted for, but nonetheless needs to be dealt with. So things like, is it acceptable for managers to shout at staff or to use, abusive language? We work in a fairly rough and tumble environment sometimes, and sometimes things can get a little rowdy, and that's okay, as long as there's no significant negative impact on the workers in that section or at the workforce. If you've got a whole heap of people being offended by bad language, by bad jokes or whatever, then you need to put a stop to it. There are certainly laws in place that will cause you problems if you don't deal with those situations as they arise. So yeah, will you tolerate offensive jokes or nicknames, things like that? Nicknames can be funny, they can be fun. People might like them, other people might not. So again, we're looking at how do we approach this across the board. If teamwork is one of your core values, do you want team members? I mean, this seems like a no-brainer to me. You want team members to listen and respect to each other's and have respect for each other's opinions. So again, we come back to this, communication, collaboration, working towards solutions, not exacerbating problems. Things around interrupting each other, things that might, be a sign of disrespect. So the other question is, if someone breaks that code, how will you discipline them? And as we said, the standard you walk by is the standard you set. And I've often said in past workshops, the problem with letting the little things go is that they turn into big things. So it may seem petty to, nitpick somebody for being 5 minutes late for work. But if that happens every day, or if that 5 minutes becomes 10 minutes and that now holds up the team, then you have a problem on your hands. So you have to think about how you would discipline somebody if they were to breach your code of conduct. So let's have a look at some of the things that you might include in your code of conduct. You might have a dress code, for example. So you might have a dress code for people who, do your sales or whatever. But the other thing, of course, is that you've got some safe work practices and personal protective equipment, so PPE. So your dress code will be guided by the type of work that's being done. If they need to wear steel-toe boots when they're working in the machinery shed, then that needs to be made clear. Alcohol, substance use and smoking, again, you need to make some rules around that. It's not healthy for plants to have smoking around them. You can't have people turning up under the influence. I've had a lot of questions about how do I know whether people are under the influence. You have to make a bit of a guess about this. If people appear to be in any way impaired. Now, it could be relating to genuine medicine. So maybe they've changed their medicines. Maybe that's having some effect. So again, those conversations are really important. But if you suspect that someone has come to work under the influence of alcohol or drugs, your obligation is to consider it from a work health and safety perspective, and that is you would not be putting someone like that into dangerous work situations or possibly any work situations. You could send them home, you could suspend them until you actually had an opportunity to investigate, but you need to make some fairly clear statements about it. Similarly, if you're serving alcohol at outside events, you need to have some fairly clear standards of behaviour when you're serving alcohol and providing alcohol to staff. You would include things around anti-harassment, discrimination and bullying to make very clear statements that that kind of behaviour won't be tolerated and that action will be taken. You might make some statements around equal opportunity, that everybody in the workplace has the same opportunities. Use of company resources, whether that's vehicles or plant machinery, photocopiers, telephones, laptops, whatever you provide for your employees. Use of company resources must be in the best interests of the company. Conflicts of interest. So if you've got someone, going out kind of competing with you in your business, so there are some conflicts of interest that might arise. Even things like attendance expectations. I had a number of growers a couple of years ago ask me, how do I get people to come to work? Really interesting question, but I think you need to be able to say, if you want a job, you come to work. You can't allow people to direct those types of things at you. You need to be very clear about that and advising you about, their attendance expectations. Health and safety, that's obviously a whole bucket load of joy on its own. Financial integrity and compliance. So whether that's reporting, whether that's payroll, whether that's around business travel or purchasing, you might want to have a statement around your financial integrity, and that might sit, for example, in your code of ethics. Data privacy. Do you protect your employees' data? What data do you share? Are your systems secured and safe? Communications, so conduct on social media and emails. We already have had in the past situations Facebook posts which have been derisive of former employers by former workers, but certainly if people are going to be making comment about your business, you need to be making some statements about what comment they might be allowed to make as a supporter of it. And what action you might take in any other event. Outside of hours conduct, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail a bit later on, and obviously intellectual property and conflicts of interest. So intellectual property is, if you've devised or developed or designed or invented something that you use specifically on your farm and that is your invention, then you want to be able to protect that. So in terms of, there might be other things that you include. You may not include all of these things. The key ones, I think, are going to be around alcohol, substance smoking, outside work, communications, I think, is very important, and bullying, harassment and things like that. So I would not like to see any kind of code of conduct, at least without those things. So those are the kinds of issues or the kinds of topics that you might begin to think about including in your code of conduct. So when we talk about implementing your code of conduct, well, this, it always starts at the top. So it starts with you as business owners. It starts with your managers who oversee staff and your supervisors and team leaders. It's a really good idea to have everybody fully trained and cognizant around the contents and the processes of your code of conduct. Once your code is defined and the programs are implemented, continuous communication becomes vital, because you need to know whether this process works. You need to know whether the code actually covers the things that you need to have it code. Did you that? Leaders, likewise, you should constantly be encouraging employees to report concerning behaviour. Now, we obviously don't want, a rash of people kind of coming in and, I guess, dobbing on people for a whole heap of minor things if they do not understand what the code of conduct works. So it's really important that everybody understands what it covers and what kind of behaviours are unacceptable, so that you're actually that employees are also able to frame those concerns. And the concerns become particularly important if those concerns, the ones that are raised, have significant impact on other people in the workplace. So, you might think that it's not such a big deal. That person might think their behaviour is not such a big deal. But if it's affecting other people, then that's where the big deal becomes the big deal. So there also needs to be assurances that whistleblowers, if you will not face adversarial action. So that is that you won't take action against people for bringing complaints to you. So you're not going to think that they're just a nuisance or a pest. But likewise, the person who is being complained about understands that they cannot also take action against a person who is making a complaint or raising concerns. So protection of those people is really important, but it's important that they understand the framework and how they make those concerns known and what you're going to do about it. Again, nothing worse if someone comes to you with an issue, particularly if it's a consistent issue and nothing is done about it. That will drive people nuts and will cause all sorts of disruptions. A pipeline for anonymous reporting is useful. It's also required. You will find that if an auditor comes on board and wants to know how you handle anonymous reporting and you don't have anything, you will be told to have something. So whether that is a box in the lunchroom, a sealed box or something similar, you need to think about how you would allow employees to report anonymously. Now, I'm not a huge supporter of anonymous reporting because it can be difficult if you don't, one, know who the complaint came from or who the complaint relates to. It can be difficult to address. So as far as possible, promote an open environment that you welcome these kinds of things. So make it clear to employees that you are serious about implementing your code of conduct and that you intend on following your procedures, so that if people do have concerns, they will be discussed and action will or may not be taken depending on the issue, but certainly that you are at the very least addressing those issues. Okay. So methods of delivering. Well, obviously, it should form part of the induction package. That's a no-brainer. And that means providing people with access to the full codes of conduct, codes of ethics, so that they have access to them, and also getting them to agree that they have read them. So on your induction form, you should have a ticker box. Have you read this? Do you understand? And do you agree to apply or to comply with our code of conduct? So have it as part of the induction package. And also implement it via training. You may need to have a toolbox meeting for half an hour really to go through all of the details and be clear about setting your expectations around performance and behaviour. And again, explaining the consequences for bad behaviour, which might be up to and including termination of employment. As I said, if current employees haven't seen the policy or haven't had access to it, you need to make sure that those employees also have access, so existing employees. Updated policy should also be provided. So any changes that you make, particularly substantive changes, you need to let people know. Again, even though laws don't change hearts overnight, they will often help change attitudes over the long term. So just a quick word about out-of-hours conduct. Now, the Commission, this is a quote from the Fair Work Commission, where they say, it is only in exceptional circumstances that an employer has a right to extend any supervision over the private activities of employees. And this was in relation to a fairly serious case involving Telstra. However, codes of conduct can apply to activities outside of the workplace, but the out-of-hours conduct must have a relevant connection and bearing on the employment relationship. So if you had a big Christmas party where you invited all your suppliers and stakeholders, etc., and staff were expected to mingle and network and engage with those suppliers, then there would be a code of conduct around that behaviour. You would be making some fairly clear statements about not overdoing it, watching your alcohol intake and reminding yourself of your professional conduct and the requirements for you to behave in certain ways. So the conduct must be such that, viewed objectively, it's likely to cause serious damage to the relationship between the employee and the employer. The conduct damages the employer's interests or reputation. or that conduct is incompatible with their duty as an employee. So if you stick to those kind of three key guidelines, they will help. But there does need to be evidential material upon which a firm finding can be made. So you can't just make a statement that something occurred if you have no evidence. You certainly cannot be terminating people if you have no evidence to support it, because in the event it does go to the Commission as an unfair termination or other form of termination, then certainly evidentiary material will be searched for. They'll be looking for it. And if you don't have it, I think you'll be plumb out of luck. Conduct outside of work involving criminal offences does not alone warrant dismissal. There still must be a relevant connection between the activity and the employee's employment. However, if the employee is unable to attend work for a significant period because they're convicted, that is, if they're imprisoned, then the employment may be terminated by the operation of the law due to what's called frustration of contract. That is, that they are unable to fulfil the obligations of their contract of employment. So just bearing in mind that just because somebody might lose their licence, if the use of their licence is not part of their requirement in work, if they can get to work and they never need to use a driver's licence at work, you may find yourself in a situation where termination is not accepted as reasonable under those circumstances. So be a bit mindful. And I always advise people, if you're going to terminate, take a deep breath, suspend. You can always bring them back in before you take any action, and that allows you to think about the issue a bit more deeply and a bit more clearly and seek professional advice if you need to. Okay, so if you are having, your Chrissy parties or, corporate events or anything like that, make sure you're really clear with your staff beforehand about your expectations and don't set them up to fail. If there is a breach of the code of conduct, the first question we always look at is it intentional or unintentional? So while we think all breaches of a code of conduct must be intentional, we ask the question first. Somebody either may have forgotten, they may not have read the policy properly, or they may just, anything may have happened. So work out if it's intentional or unintentional. That will affect the way that you actually manage the process. So we talk about misconduct and we talk about serious misconduct. So misconduct is not necessarily a termination offence. It's less severe and may not seriously impact on disciplinary action may be the outcome, but termination is less likely. So that's a kind of minor offence. Somebody has turned up late a couple of times or something relatively minor. Serious misconduct, by contrast, is of such a nature that it literally destroys the trust and confidence between the employer and the employee, or is so egregious in nature that termination is the only or the most likely outcome, that there is no way that employment relationship can continue. And for those reasons we talked about earlier, the destruction of the relationship with the employer, the employer, some damage to the employee's business or reputation or otherwise. It's crucial to include a section on misconduct and serious misconduct. You might define them, or you can define serious misconduct. You might leave misconduct undefined or defined as something less than serious misconduct. Again, it's useful to name behaviours that are inappropriate. We won't stand for bullying. We won't stand for sexual harassment. We won't stand for drunkenness. We won't stand for drug abuse. We won't stand for et cetera, et cetera. We won't stand for yelling. All of those kind of things, again, that you want to share with your employees, and to avoid any kind of misunderstandings or miscommunication. So you make it clear that your business does not permit certain behaviours. And if they've signed off on their code of conduct and they've signed off on their induction documents at the beginning, then any breach of that code will clearly lead you, or potentially leads you, down the path to either misconduct or serious misconduct actions. Now, again, I just want to raise this one. So be mindful of the unfair dismissal provisions. Again, that's why I'm always telling people to get advice or, seek some additional information around how you might go about terminating. A substantial or willful breach of a policy will usually constitute a valid reason for dismissal, provided you have followed your processes. However, a finding that an employee has failed to comply with policies and procedures does not mean that dismissal is not harsh, unjust, or unreasonable. So again, like we talked about with the criminal offence, just because an employee has breached a policy in, one way, a small way perhaps, it will not mean that the termination on that basis is not harsh. So when the Commission looks at whether a termination is harsh, unjust, or unreasonable, they look at whether the employee actually did the thing the employer said they did, whether they had been provided with advice prior to it that they shouldn't be doing it, whether they had been warned, for example, about behaviour, had they been warned about poor behaviour or poor conduct in the past. So you've got to think about how serious, and again, that's why we look at, is it intentional, is it unintentional, and is it misconduct, or does it reach that higher level in order for it to be categorised as serious misconduct? If widespread, so in each case, all of the circumstances are taken into account by the Commission in when they're considering whether or not a termination is unfair or not. If widespread breaches of policy occur without an employer response, this will weigh against the employer and the decision that the dismissal was justified, unjust, or was not harsh, unjust, or unreasonable. So what I mean by that is, if you have allowed that standard to be passed by numerous times, so if this is the first time you've actually picked someone up on it, but you've allowed others to walk past it, that will be seen as unfair. That will be seen as unfair. So if there is a history of you letting these things go, that termination will be considered to be harsh, unjust, or unreasonable under the circumstances. It's also not sufficient to find that there is a valid reason for an employee's dismissal simply because someone has lost trust and confidence in an employee's ability to perform their role. So you need to be able to provide sufficient evidence and reasoning to support this statement. And that includes, have you worked with the employee? Have you identified the poor performance or the conduct? Have you requested and provided a time frame in which that employee can improve their behaviour or conduct? Have you done a review of whether or not that behaviour or conduct has improved? So these things don't need to go over long periods of time. But if you go into the Commission without that process, then it's highly likely that the outcome will go against you. So process is everything when it comes into these types of dealings with the Commission. You must be able to demonstrate evidence. You must be able to demonstrate that the employee genuinely did the thing you're claiming, and that it actually warrants termination on that basis. So that's just to avoid some of the worst cases of unfair dismissal. And I can tell you that, having managed quite a number of unfair dismissal cases on behalf of employers in the past, one of the biggest things that comes from employees is, I wasn't told and I didn't know. So that's why it's really important to make sure that employees sign off their induction sheet to say, yes, we were provided with this information and we agree that we will follow it. Okay, there's just an example. I thought one example was interesting because, interestingly enough, there was a case that I was reading the other day where one was terminated and the other was not. And you kind of always think about, how does this come about? Generally, in the absence of extenuating circumstances, a dismissal for fighting will not be viewed as harsh, unjust, or unreasonable. So if someone comes in and takes a punch at you and you terminate, then you're on fairly solid ground there. However, extenuating circumstances, which the Commission would look at, will include the circumstances in which the fight occurred, such as whether it was provoked, so whether there was a high level of provocation, even though generally we as reasonable human beings suggest that provocation is not an excuse. Again, it depends on those circumstances, or whether that employee was acting in self-defence. They will also look at things like the length of service, including the work record of that employee. So if they've had a perfect work record for 15, 20 years or whatever, and this is the first episode of bad behaviour, what else is going on in that person's life? So there may be other reasons why this person conducted themselves in such a way. If the wife left, the dog died, the car's broken. I mean, whatever. You don't know what goes on. And that's why investigation and questioning and discussion around these issues is really important. So think about the work record. Someone who's had a perfect work record for 15 years all of a sudden turns up one day and loses his cool. Will the Commission view that, even though he's punched out the manager or something, will the Commission view that termination to be harsh, unjust, or unreasonable under the circumstances? That will depend on what actions you took. So what actions did you take to understand what was going on with that employee at the time? Was it just a lost moment? And whether or not the employee was in a supervisory position, although I don't think this is meant to suggest that supervisors have a better, are able to get into fights, but certainly an employee who decides to take on their supervisor because they don't want to follow rules, those kinds of things will come into play as well. So again, it's all about the circumstances in which these breaches of code or even breaches of other code will apply. So the Commission will take into account all of those circumstances surrounding the incident and not merely establish who the aggressor was. So it may be in a case where your long-term employee lost his lolly for 5 minutes. He may not be found to be, or his termination may be found to be harsh or unjust or unreasonable. So it's worth remembering those kind of key points. Okay, so the key takeaways, I'm sorry, I've run a little bit over time. A code of conduct and a code of ethics, whether that's one comprehensive document or whether that's two separate documents, is a must. Get that into place. And the other reason that we're doing it is, just to remind you, is that retailers have an obligation now to report under the Anti-Slavery Act to the government. So their obligation is to report how they are identifying and addressing issues around modern slavery. And a lot of that comes in under your code of ethics and your code of conduct. So they then push those obligations down to you. So your obligation is now to demonstrate to those guys that you have these procedures and these frameworks in place, and then they can then report to the government that their supply chain is all tickety-boo. It's a lived document. Its principles should be reflected in the performance and conduct of all your employees. Don't write it and stick it on a shelf. Live it. Remind people it's there. Stick it on the lunch wall, the lunchroom wall, and remind people it's there. Have a toolbox meeting to talk about it, whatever. Identify what is unacceptable behaviour. Induct, train and discuss the issues with staff and managers. Look for ways to improve conduct and culture. If you've got some grumpy bums out there, and we all know that it might be you, it might be the supervisor. Again, that's okay. Quiet people, introverts, men of few words, they're all good. The question comes about their impact of their behaviour on other workers. So when it becomes a problem is when you look at it. Ensure the policy is implemented at all levels at all times, and follow up with complaints and protect your whistleblower. Again, what we've said is the standard you walk past is the standard that you accept. Okay, that's it for today. Bear in mind, we have all of these standards established under Fair Farms. We have training fully available either online or through face-to-face training with myself. Our Fair Farms manual, which is only available to Fair Farms members, has all of the templates around this issue that you could possibly need. And obviously, if you're in an audit situation, we can run through an audit checklist with you to make sure that all those requirements are met. I come to you today from beautiful, windy but sunny Yeppoon, and I'll be at the Pineapple Field Days. So anybody online who might be at the Pineapple Field Days, come and see me at the GrowCom stand. We'll be obviously at our Fair Farms National Conference on the 20th of October. If you haven't already, please do register. We'd love to see you come along and join us at that. We'll be at the National Farmers Federation National Conference in Canberra, as well as the Western Australia Horticulture Update in Perth, better known as Wahoo. And we also have some Fair Farms workshops coming to Bowen, Marillion and Mareeba end of this month, beginning of next month. There's the poster for our Fair and Ethical Sourcing Conference. Tickets are available online and they're available now. again, can I just say thank you so much for joining me today. Really great to have so many people on board and to see the continued interest. I haven't yet got a topic for next month, but that will be coming out to you in a week or so. Take good care. If I see you at Pineapple Field Day, great. Otherwise, look after yourselves and bye for now.